Remember growing up how we'd always listen to the advice of our parents, the advice of our teachers and our grandparents. Well, nothing's really changed. You know, children still look up to their parents and those in authority. Sadly, these days, we've also got the problem of the internet. We've got the problem of TV and social networks. But children do believe in the advice they're given. Remember the things we would say as children, or we heard as children, you know, don't go near that stove, it's hot, or the Green Cross code, or be careful where you cross the road. Stay where I can see you. All those bits of advice, great advice. Nothing changes though when it comes to breakfast. Whatever we tell our children as parents, they look up to us for our advice, and surely it must be right. We say things like, something's better than nothing. We say, don't leave home without breakfast. It's the most important meal of the day. As a dad, for years, I heard myself say those very sentences to my children. Little did I know that I was unwittingly signing them up for an addiction. You see, I really believe sugar is an addiction. In fact, later on we'll explain scientifically why it is an addiction. And of course, any addiction to something that's actually not healthy could potentially threaten my children's lives. When it comes to loading our children up with sugar, breakfast cereals is perhaps the biggest culprit of all. You see, for many, many years, it's been advertised and marketed as something that's very healthy. Very healthy. You just think about just close your eyes a second and think about all those adverts you've seen over the years. Well, is it very healthy? That's the big question. They put lovely cartoon characters onto the packaging. They give away even toys inside many of the cereals. And I can remember collecting little cards that came with cereals. Anything at all to get us not just addicted to the flavour, but addicted to pestering our parents to get more and more and more. But of course, they are engineered for addiction. Cereals are simply a recipe for disaster, and quite literally, we're inviting serial killers into our kitchen. Now, I know this goes against how you and I were raised. We were, after all, repeating what we were told from our parents. But the world's moved on, and now we understand a little bit more, or I should say a lot more, about what happens to grains when we ingest them. Because grains, remember, once we ingest them, turns into sugar. And if we give our children too much sugar in the morning, we put them on what we call the carbo coaster. Carb overload, body releases insulin, we grab that sugar and we go and store it as body fat if we don't use it straight away. But that all comes later in the breakout videos from this little session. For now, I want to recognize the fact and say well done for once to governments, to supermarkets, to cereal companies. At least you're now putting traffic light systems on your cereal package that kind of is a step in the right direction to tell us how much sugar you've added. But that could also be a potential big problem for us and mask an even bigger problem. You see, because all carbohydrates, and let's face it, cereals are virtually nothing but carbohydrates, turn into sugar once we've ingested them. We now know that sugar and overloading on carbohydrates, especially in the morning, can be directly linked to most of the chronic illnesses that we face here in Great Britain. And I'm desperate to wipe them out. Well, maybe not to wipe them out, that's probably too much for one movement on our own, but I'd really like to make a serious dent into these chronic illnesses, especially for my own family, for my close friends, and for you watching this film right now. It's really, really important to understand that the cereals could be killers, to understand that carb overloading for many people, not everybody, there are some people that aren't sensitive to glucose at all and sugar at all. But a lot of people, most people in fact, are in some way sensitive to the amount of sugar and carbohydrates that we ingest. Now, I can't save my grandparents who sadly died of cancer, or my lovely Auntie Avis, or a very good friend of mine who was a wonderful piano teacher called Carl, who at the age of 35 passed away. I can't do anything about the past, but I can try and make sure for my family members and my friends that we avoid the cancers, or at least understand more about it and understand that a lot of it is in our own control. And some people say what I preach is frightening. I think it's completely the opposite. We can't deny that we're surrounded by cancer and dementia. We can't deny that we're surrounded by people dying of heart attacks at early ages, and that's kind of frightening. But I think it's quite comforting to know that in many, many ways, the food that we eat is probably the biggest contributing factor to all chronic illnesses. So let's start doing something about it, and let's start doing something about it at breakfast time. Ask any parent what they want for their children, and I would hope it would be along the lines of for their children to live happily, healthily, and for as long as possible. And yet the very thing that we set our children up with in the mornings, breakfast, normally does anything but that. And that's why I'm taking the message out to schools. I want to help schools set your and my children up properly for the day. I want them to give them good nutrition to kick their day off, because you know what, the effects later in life can start from the food and the nourishment, or the lack of nourishment, that children get in their breakfast at an early age.